Matt, NHTSA recently published a final rule requiring automatic emergency braking, including pedestrian automatic emergency braking systems on light vehicles. Those are vehicles weighing under 10,000 gross pounds. This standard states that the system must apply to the brakes automatically up to 90 miles an hour. That's fast. My daughter would say, zoom, zoom. You're in a Zoomie-mobile on that one. When a collision with a lead vehicle is intimate, and up to 45 miles an hour when a pedestrian is detected. Is LiDAR required to meet this standard?
Hey, Grayson, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on your show again. This is a great opportunity, and I really want to dive deep into this new regulation. And maybe let's take a journey through looking at the different aspects of this and the aspects of regulations across the whole spectrum of not only the cars that we drive, but the autonomy space as well. The easy answer is no, lasers are not, or LiDARs are not required for this. But I think a single sensing modality, as we've talked about multiple times in the past, a single sensing modality is probably not going to cut it. So I think that when you look at as we've talked about multiple times in the past, my favorite is, of course, radar plus a camera, an optical system. And I think that will still look to be a dominant player in how different OEMs are going to meet this particular regulation. I think it's good. So when you think about the takeaways from this, right? This is good from a radar standpoint. It will finally be the thing that says, okay, every car will probably need to have a radar on it. So every car that's homologated to the US, in 5 years from now, is now going to have at least one radar on it. So for all those like me, they're in the radar camp for years and years and years, like, woo, we win. But I think it's important also to think about how is this going to push the radar technology, or is this going to be something that's predominantly achieved with the systems of today? We're going to see how that plays out over the next few years.
Pushing radar tech, is that having a breakthrough? Is that developing a new radar chip? You have a background in DoD defense stuff, which is fascinating. We all saw what radar did for Texas Instruments during the Vietnam War. It changed everything. It changed the war. Do we have to have that another major breakthrough similar to that we've had on the military applications with radar?
That's a great question. I don't think so for this. I think that what you need to do is we need to make sure that what we do with the radar data is really hitting the needs of this particular use case. How we use the data versus needing some brand new technology. I would say that it's important also to contrast this particular reg versus full L4. L4 is much more of a driver for technology advancement than this particular regulation, or predominantly NCAP or other regulations. So I don't think you'll need much new technology, but you will need to make sure that you've sharpened the pencil on how you use the data. And especially as you look at some of the pedestrian AEB situations, basically how auto braking for when it's a pedestrian, not a vehicle in front of you, thinking how we really use that in low light conditions with using whatever we can from the camera to fuse that information in the best way possible. From the ranges they talk, or the speeds they talk about, I think it's 45 miles an hour for pedestrians, something like that. That's not a huge amount of sensitivity that you need for that. That's braking distances of less than 30 meters. So I think that you don't need to see 300 meters or anything to achieve that. But I think what you need to do is on the software side and on how you use the data products, you need to make sure that you sharpen the pencil on that so that you're getting what you want and mitigate the false alarms as best as possible. We'll probably talk about false alarms a little bit later in this. I know we will. I promise you.
There's a lot of false alarms out there. They have it at school. Somebody thinks it's funny to pull the fire alarm and everybody has to evacuate the school. In a vehicle, sometimes perhaps it's a dot and sees something. The vehicle has phantom braking. There's a lot of vehicles out there, unfortunately, not just Tesla, but other vehicles that have the phantom braking issues there. I want to ask you, Apple had their worldwide developer conference the other day, and there was a big debate around data with the ChatGPT integration, how Apple is a privacy-first company. All the data is going to stay on the phone, and now it's going to the cloud. There's a lot of controversy around that. Stock sold off 2% after the announcement today. It's up 6.12%. Not sure why, because all the people that actually build the tech are starting to question Apple's motives there. But on the data standpoint, we've never really discussed this. And now you've got my curiosity hat on here. I'm in school with Professor Markel here. What data does radar generate?
It's a great question. One of the things that as we look at one of the benefits of radar is its ability to be used in privacy sensitive applications. So whether you are in an automotive application or an autonomy application like this, or in home use or hospital use or whatever, the radar is a lot easier to make people comfortable with from a privacy standpoint. That's what's in the airport scanners now, and when we kind of just accept that. There's a little bit of pushback in the beginning, but I think we realized like, okay, it doesn't have the resolution. It can't tell what I really look like in that scanner. So privacy is a big thing. But when we think about radar, we get a lot of, there's the canonical types of things that we get out of it. Radar people will talk about radar observables like range and velocity and the angular position. And then they'll talk about like with some extra processing, things like classification and micro Doppler estimations of like, this is a person, so we can see this person walking, or we can see that they're walking with a limp, things like that. So there's types of information that we talk about on the radar observable standpoint. But I think the best way to think about radar is it's presenting back information about every angular location in its field of view and every range out that it's instrumented in terms of whether or not energy is there. And I think that's when we think about how do we really want to use radar in these advanced applications, especially as we get into L4, that concept of surveilling the scene and letting the customers of the data know, yes, at 30 meters out in front of me and 15 meters off to the side at 20 miles an hour, I see no energy there, but I see energy there at 15 miles an hour. And that both of those two statements provide a tremendous amount of information to the consumer of the data. The fact that something's there is, of course, really important. The fact that the radar says there's nothing there can be equally important, because if you're trying to make, say, an unprotected turn or be able to do a complicated maneuver, you don't want to do that if there's somebody coming. And the fact that something's not there can be just as important to that decision making as the fact that there is something there.
Wow. I'm impressed. Professor Markel delivers again. Going back to the Apple analogy, does the data from the radar stay on the edge, or use the Apple term, inside the vehicle, or is that going to a cloud to get fused with the other sensors? Or where does that data from the vehicle application of that radar, where is that data living and where does it go?
So with most applications, it stays on vehicle for a couple reasons. One is the offload costs, at least for OTA, for over-the-air capabilities, can become extremely expensive. And the other thing is if you're offloading it, you're only offloading it for use after the fact. I don't think any system that's operating today or will be operating in the near future is relying on off-vehicle processing for safety critical and real-time based events. Those are just, the latency is just too great to bear on that. We need to be making decisions in hundreds of milliseconds, sometimes even less, but typically on the order of hundreds of milliseconds. When we start pushing things up, we've all seen the situation where we're on the phone or something and it cuts out for a little bit. The data is like, why can I not get to ESPN? I need the score right now, and it's a little bit slower. Well, that's fine with it's a phone call, because you can ultimately just call the person back or wait a little bit, but not for safety critical situations. Those are extremely important that you get those decisions made in essentially near real time. The only way to really do that, at least from not only my belief, but what the dominant players in the industry would believe, is like that has to be done on vehicle. The data stay on vehicle, and then anything that goes off of that, well, we can decide, or the system developer, the system architect can decide what goes off vehicle that's their own decision, right? And they could take everything from the raw data. That's extremely, extremely expensive. And most of even the L4 players have difficulty saving all the raw data for every mile that they drive from the sensors. Or you can use some sort of compression on that. Typically, we will compress it into some sort of data products. And those data products could be like, look, I only saw these 25 things, or here's a range Doppler map, which is basically just that space I talked about before, highlighting where the energy is. And they save those as a lot smaller aspect of information.
What impact does that have on the compute? Do these vehicles have to have a higher level of compute versus a traditional vehicle without the AEB, without all the sensors? Do we need a higher level of compute? And if you do, and from an electric vehicle standpoint, does that have a larger draw on the battery, or are these radar systems so highly optimized for efficiency that it doesn't really have an impact at all?
So I think in 2022, 90% of the vehicles in the US, and 90% of the vehicles sold that model year, I think already had AEB on them. I think it's something like that number. So they've already factored the radar cost into the battery budget if it's an EV, or into the electrical system if it's internal combustion. The question would be like, do they need to change the compute and reallocate or increase the amount of power going to the computers. Basically, you pay for what you use, right? If the computer's sitting there idle, it's not drawing that many watts. If it's doing a lot of stuff, it takes more wattage. So that's something that we'll need to look at. However, in the grand scheme of things, when you think of moving a multi-ton vehicle and the amount of power it takes to do that, the amount of energy it takes to do that versus an extra computer for part of the time, most of the time, the draw on the system is not really dominated by the compute, especially for an incremental change like this. So it's not like you're going to see like, oh, I used to be able to go 200 miles. Now I can only go 50 miles because of this darn AEB thing. No, it's not going to be like that. It's probably going to be imperceptible.
Does LiDAR have any impact on the battery, or is it very similar to radar in terms of power draw?
I think it's going to be higher, but again, I don't think it's going to break the bank on what an OEM is going to choose to put in their sensing suite to meet this regulation. I think that the decision for LiDAR versus radar will be made by other considerations such as cost, reliability, how many I need to have to cover a particular field of view, where can I place those? Are they going to get mucked up with dirt because they need to place them in a certain spot? Are they going to be able to be blended into the industrial design of the vehicle in a way that makes me happy to sell this vehicle? At Waymo, when I was at Waymo, we made a vehicle that very much focused on making the sensors front and center. And you saw all the sensing capabilities that were on there. And that was a conscious decision. Now, we tried to make them very pretty. The lady that leads their industrial design team was fantastic, and she had a wonderful team. They're very pretty, but they're not hidden. And I think that when you think about that mindset of these things have to be out there and they have to be able to be used, that was Waymo. They're a L4 autonomy company. They want people to see the sensors because it could potentially give a potential rider more confidence in the system. It's like, well, look at all these sensors on here. Yeah, I'll get into that. Look at all those things. Whereas if you're selling a BMW or a Mercedes or Tesla, those are the industrial design of those, and to not make the sensors front and center, that's more of their style. They don't want people to see the sensors. So that makes it even more difficult to integrate a laser or LiDAR system onto the vehicle.
If a consumer is going to spend $100,000 on a vehicle, they don't want it to look like a Waymo. Waymo's a great vehicle. You don't own the Waymo vehicle, you use it, and you're right. The sensors build the trust for the public. Look at this as 360-degree vision. The Waymo vehicle with the eye paces look beautiful. The design with the new sensor suite looks really nice as well. But if you're going to spend $100,000 on a personally owned vehicle, you don't want to see all this stuff. You don't want it to look like a Lego. You built it with a box of Legos. So you have to hide the sensor suite because that's what the consumers want. When you hide the radar, do you see any degradation in performance? Does it have to be out there full front, or can you hide it into the industrial design of a vehicle without degrading the performance?
Other than Waymo or perhaps Cruise or someone in the L4 space, everyone hides the radar in some way that they deem acceptable to their industrial design goals. So you don't see radars on any of the vehicles. Now, that could be behind a grill or integrated into a grill. That could be, which is usually the easiest the best from the radar standpoint. Usually if you get a radar that's kind of like taking up some space behind a minimally intrusive grill, you've won, because you have the fewest headaches to have to deal with anything on the integration side. If you didn't win as much, then you're behind some sort of secondary structure like a fascia or whatever. And there can be issues with those, with the wavefront, to get too geeky, but how the wavefront is distorted by that and the space between that and the radome, which is the very external portion of the radar. If there's differences in the spacing and how that, basically you have another thing that you have to look through, and you might not get to look through it the same way all the time. There might be subtle variations that mess that up. So, but still, those are things that for these L2 features that most folks have mitigated, and they've mitigated into an acceptable level that lets them balance achieving the specifications of the regulation and achieving an industrial design that they're happy with and they feel will sell cars. So now with L4, when you get into that gets a little bit more tricky. And again, it comes down to how the system's architected and how much reliance you're putting on the radar. But at Waymo, we had no additional features in front of the radar. And that was a big deal back in the latter part of the last decade, of that, are you going to let these radars be a surface on the vehicle? And we ultimately decided to, because it was safer.
And Waymo is proven. The track record's there. The public data's there. There's a report from Swiss Re that the Waymo driver, the Waymo vehicles are extremely safe. They're safer than a human driver, despite some of the benchmarks some lunatics want to put on it. The Waymo driver performs better. Let's just get into it. The Waymo driver does not get distracted. We're in California. The Waymo driver doesn't drive around, smoke a bong, and get high. The Waymo driver doesn't drink and drive. The Waymo driver does not have emotions in an economy that is teetering on the brink. It has one job to get you there is safely. And that brings up a really interesting quote around the L4 debate, because last week in an interview with Bloomberg, Mr. Jim Farley, CEO of Ford, talked about Ford's ambitions for L3, SAE Level 3. And I'm going to quote Mr. Farley here because this was pretty eye-opening, unquote. Level 3 autonomy will allow you to go hands and eyes off the road on the highway in a couple of years. So then your car becomes like an office. You could do a conference call and all sorts of stuff. That's a scary statement. You were at Waymo way in the early days, and I think it must have been Mr. Brin or Mr. Page made a comment around the data from when Waymo was discussing level 3 before they went to level 4. And I believe I'll defer to you on this, but that it was reckless because the Waymo employees that were testing the vehicle would doze off and do all sorts of, I'll just say silly things, stare at their phones and stuff. And Waymo, at that time, Google Self-Driving Car Project, made the decision to go L4. But yet you have a major auto manufacturer saying, hey, we're going to do this. Why do you think there's such a divergence in this technology and the way that companies are approaching different levels of autonomy?
Well, lots of good things to talk about on that. One, so I'm going to circle back to Waymo's decision here in just a second. But first of all, I think that it would probably be worthwhile to double click on what Ford's CEO said, because of all the things that is going on in his mind of the impending economic troubles of the United States, increased costs due to unions, employees striking, the electrification thing that's like was big and now is not big, and what do I do with that? All the things that are going on in his mind, he may not be, and I say this with nothing but respect, but he might not be the one who is like really at the zen of the taxonomy of L3 versus L4. And if that's the case, I want to give him a pass on that. But I think that you and I and most of the players that are in the real autonomy space know that L3 is sketchy, and it's sketchy for a variety of reasons. We don't see the full ramifications of what mass market penetration of L3 will be yet. But what we saw at Waymo back in the day was, so this is around the 2012 timeframe. So this actually predates my time there. But when I used to give speeches on behalf of Waymo, I would show these videos. So obviously I can't show the videos on a podcast, but what we would show was to tell the story of like, these are the vehicles that we would let employees take at nights and over the weekend. And at that point, the Waymo driver was limited to basically freeways. So it's kind of like a freeway L3 capability there. And what we told them was like, look, this is really good technology. We believe it's solid. And we wouldn't give you something that we didn't believe was safe. However, it's a developmental technology and you never know what can happen. So what you got to do is, we told them two things. One is you got to still pay attention the whole time. You got to have your hands near the wheel and your eyes on the road and pay attention the whole time. And number two, and that's for your safety. And number two, we're going to have cameras inside the vehicle to monitor you. And that's definitely for your safety, because if you have like a heart attack or if something happens to you, we want to be able to know that. Also, remember, these cameras are on you. So the first time people would take the cars out is they were like the Waymo safety drivers. They were like eyes on the road, eyes glued to the road, hands at right at 10 and 2, just off the steering wheel, ready to take over at a moment's notice. However, after about the second drive, when the driver handled everything essentially flawlessly, we saw them basically operating without that level of rigor. And what I would show in the videos was some funny things, like they had one where they had a gentleman who was obviously in the driver's seat, but he had his laptop in the passenger seat and he was coding. I don't know whether he was recompiling code for the vehicle or not at that point. Hopefully not, but he was doing some coding. Another one, a lady was using an eyelash curler, and so she had the visor down and was looking in the mirror on that. It was just, by the way, she's moving at highway speeds. All these folks are moving at highway speeds. She's doing the eyelashes. And then the third one was, I would show a video of someone who'd actually fallen asleep behind the wheel. And you can tell, because like when you're falling asleep and you've fallen asleep for a little bit, you get that little jerk every so often. That's what happened to this one individual. And these are our employees who Waymo could, ostensibly terminate for failure to operate the vehicles with these under the constraints that they were told to. Imagine what the general public is going to do in this situation. We've already seen aspects of that with Tesla and people misusing that system and not following it to the letter of what the limitations on the system are. And there's a term we can bring in from aviation, which is that happens for airplanes when they are on autopilot, is they've found out that when something goes sketchy in the aircraft, after the plane has been on autopilot and the pilots have been enjoying the fact that it's on autopilot, they will be susceptible to something called the startle effect, where if something does go wrong, they will take a delayed or inappropriate response to this that's actually worse than if you had just been flying the aircraft on your own. So their response to when the red light goes off is worse, and they could take the wrong action, or they could be slower to respond than if they'd been flying the plane in the first place. And of course, that translates directly into what we see with the L3 and how that's going to be. So if you follow the rules and still pay attention, great. If it's a system that meets the minimum requirements of L3, which is it's driving until it doesn't have to, and it lets you know potentially very little notice, I'm not a fan of that, because I think that can actually cause us, that can make a situation less safe.
It will make it less safe. So NHTSA is publicly out there saying that this new mandate will save 360 lives a year and prevent at least 24,000 injuries annually. You throw in L3 at 80 miles an hour, I'm very sorry, NHTSA, you're not going to hit that goal. It's going to get scary. As Mr. Markel said, the startle effect is very, very real. Raises the question, is L3 a stepping stone to full autonomy, or merely just a distraction?
It's a great question. I think you could look at L3. You could also look at this particular regulation under that same light. It's like, is this a distraction, or is it something that's pushing us along the way? And when we think about this regulation, we don't really know the downside or the opportunity cost of this yet. Every regulation, there's a ton of costs for compliance, and that money has to come from somewhere. So most likely that's going to come from, you can't pass those costs just onto the consumers because they'll buy less. People are holding onto cars longer now anyway, and they just won't buy. And you think about this also, if left to their own devices, would that 90% have creeped up to 96, 97, 98, 100% or so in the next 5 years anyway. But you still have to pay for all the compliance aspects of this. So when we think about the stepping stones, I think that the true safety really only comes from L4. And if you look at their numbers on this, the 360 some odd lives, let's assume that their estimates are 100% accurate. How many people did we lose on the road this last year?
Over 40,000.
So we're talking about 360 lives, which are important, of course, but against the backdrop of 46,000 lives lost. So that's a small percentage. So is this a stepping stone to full autonomy? No. And is L3 a stepping stone? The answer to both of those is really not really, because when you think about the responsibility that you take on as an L4 system developer, you have to cover all the use cases. You have to cover all the situations, or at least all those in the ODD that you're going to be driving. If you want to cover the compliance with this, there's a set of spec cases that you have to hit, and then you hit those once, and then you're done. And there's no way that even at the length of this regulation at 317 or so pages, that's going to capture the completeness to test against all the different conditions that you would need to make an L4 system. So it's going to make something that passes the test, and that level of performance will, by definition, be less than what you would have in an L4 system.
Pass the test, and then you have some individuals that are trying to take advantage of this mandate. I'm not saying that they lobbied for it. I'm not saying they lobbied against it. I'm merely stating the facts in this one. You had one sensor company in their Q1 2024 investor letter. The AEB mandate was mentioned 15 times. It was the lead into the investor report. Not how our business is performing, even though their business is not performing very well and on the verge of bankruptcy. It was all about AEB and why it make our business better. But yet this company was focused on L4. Now they're focused on this mandate, trying to find where they want the market to go. When you speak to larger suppliers, they're really not focused on the mandate. Yes, we'll make it a part of our business. For certain smaller companies, does this mandate become a distraction as they work on pursuing their L4 goals?
When you think of sensor companies, and I say this having been the CEO of one, so I kind of have a little bit of personal insight into this. but you're viewing things through a lens that's very much self-centered. You believe that we can get into whole lots of human philosophy and how we view the world and so forth, but we often are looking at through a lens that's very focused on us. And this mandate for that particular sensor company could be very big news for them. But in the grand scheme of things, I'm not sure that I would count on that. And by the way, this is a mandate that's out 5 years from now, right? That's really only has to be hit in 5 years. So if you need a particular laser or so whatever, that at that time frame, and you need sales in 2025 for cash flow reasons, it's probably not the way to get yourself there. So I think that it's important to realize whenever a CEO, or especially to an investor deck, some things like that, or earnings report talks about things, they're viewing that through the lens of how they sit in the world. And that may or may not be accurate for what someone else is viewing it as, whether that's another sensor type company in a different modality, et cetera.
It might have been big news to the company. Investors didn't buy it, sent the stock tumbling when they put out the filing. The market's not buying it.
And don't sound disparaging at all on this, but it does seem a little bit like a Hail Mary, that this will be the thing that finally gives us the traction we need. And as with any Hail Mary, that can work, but it's also the probability is not super great.
If you were CEO of an autonomous driving company, not a sensor company today, how would you approach the mandate, and what advice would you give to your engineering and your leadership team?
That's a good question. I think as having been a CEO, at least in a related field to this, there is no shortage of people telling you their advice on what you ought to do as chief executive officer. And as a matter of fact, if you find that there's a shortage of people telling you that, you've lost cell coverage or your email's down, because there's always people that will tell you their opinions on you ought to do this. Thinking back to Waymo as an example, Waymo, you need to double down on the ride hailing, the core business with the iPaces. You need to double down on the last mile. You need to really go all in on trucking. Trucking is going to be the first way to get to market. What you need to be doing is you need to be licensing your stuff to others, because that's where the real market penetration is going to be. Conflicting. You can't double down on every single thing. Otherwise, all you're doing is hedging bets, which is in itself a strategy, but that's different than doubling down on something or going all in on a particular thing. If I were to tell a CEO of an autonomy company right now, based on my experience, not only in the industry, but as a corporate leader, you've got to run your own race. You have got to make the decisions because you're in the chair. You are the sole leader responsible for guiding this ship into a safe harbor that's beneficial to not only the customers, but the employees, the investors, all the stakeholders, all of your ecosystem. So run your own race. And if that race is driven by diversification into other things, mentioning they might license the Waymo driver, which, by the way, that's been talked about as a strategy since before I joined the company back in 2017. So it's not anything new, the fact that that's brought up. But in particular, other than run your own race, is look at this in terms of what this really means for your self-driving company. The real benefit of autonomous ride hailing from a customer standpoint and a unique selling proposition standpoint is not the safety aspects. I don't think anybody is going to make a decision between choosing a Waymo or choosing a Lyft based on, well, Waymo technically is 6% safer, as demonstrated in their 200-page report that they just put up on their website. No one's going to do that. I mean, the number of people that do that would be very, very small. I might geek out over the numbers because I'm a geeky, guy like that. But ultimately, the safety is not going to be the dominant thing. Safety is what we tell regulators. Safety is what we tell cities, and it is good. It will help. But people get into this because of standard types of business marketing concepts of it's a better experience, or it's cheaper, or it's more available, or I identify with the brand because, like Harley Davidson or Apple, I identify with the brand because that's who I am. Those are the reasons why people will choose a ride-hailing L4 company versus a ride-hailing manned ride like an Uber or a Lyft. It's not for the safety aspects. So run your own race and don't get bent out of shape about the fact that potentially the cars that everyone else is driving are getting safer.
At the end of the day, it comes down to the brand and the experience. The Waymo vehicles, you can read countless threads on X or on Reddit, how wonderful they can take a phone call in the vehicle without a driver listening to you and chirping and commenting on it. In San Francisco, this happens in New York, it happens in Miami. You're in the back seat. What do? And you start getting pitched. Well, I've got this, and this. Doesn't happen in a Waymo vehicle. And the other thing that's not highlighted enough, and I believe this really comes down to communications issues, the Waymo product is a consistent experience. Every time you get into an I-Pace, it's clean, it's consistent. That has to be highlighted and emphasized more. From the AEB standpoint, it seems that if you're a CEO and you're going all in on this, you're communicating one message, but you should be communicating the message of that everybody has to have this. We're not going to go all in on this. This is part of our requirements to stay in business. And if you are developing an L4, continue to stay in L4 because L4 is safer than with the AEB mandate. And at some point in the future, we will have personally owned autonomous vehicles. I got confirmation that a very large global international OEM is actually working on personally owned autonomous vehicles now with their own program. Well, when you have an L4 system, you and I both know the AEB mandate is met, and you're not going to get distracted. In your opinion, Matt, how do you see this mandate rolling out? Is it just going to be for the global automakers that don't have a personally owned program yet? And are they going to introduce it in the higher line vehicles first and gradually work their way down to lower vehicles? There's going to be a mandate says we got to do this. They're going to put it everywhere at once, jack the price up. And if they do jack the price up, you and I know what's going to happen. The consumer's just going to keep that older vehicle longer and longer and longer.
Where it rolls out is a function of each individual vehicle line and the tech insertion opportunities along the way. So each line has like, okay, we're going to do a refresh at this point. And 5 years is a pretty long time frame to make sure that you've got a radar and ADAS system upgrade, somewhere planned into that. Some might be right away. Ruling talked about some vehicles are already there, that they hit all these just right out of the gate. So obviously they don't have to do anything. And then the rest of them will roll it out as it makes sense from them as a business. I don't think anybody's going to be clamoring like, oh, finally we have an opportunity to do this. No one's going to do that. It's going to be whatever makes sense from a business standpoint. Since rarely does safety actually sell, it's probably going to be towards the end point of that 5 years for the small section of people that don't have it today, to the end point of that 5 years versus the near point of that. But I think more than, well, at least one thing we haven't discussed yet is like, what are the unintended consequences of this? So I have a friend who bought a new car recently. He was driving a complete beater before. It was the car that we talk about like, wow, I've driven this since college. I don't think he drove it since college, but he's driven it for a while. It was like some, Toyota Corolla or something like that. Nothing against those, but it's like this thing had been around a while. A lot of miles on it. And I'm not sure even if the door is sealed up appropriately. You could probably upgrade a little bit here. And he finally bought a new car, and it's got lots of bells and whistles in it, and includes an AEB system, just like we're talking about in this regulation. But he has had a ton of issues with false braking on this. In addition, he's had so I haven't gotten a chance to actually look at any of the data or anything on it, but it sounds like he might be getting hit with RFI from other things in the environment as well. And now that RFI is tied into, RFI is radio frequency interference. So it's something that's not a signal you sent out coming back. It's like, it could be another radar. It could be something else. It could be something else operating in that band. And if the signal comes back, it's confused in the radar on your vehicle as being a target of interest and something you need to take action on. And now you take action on this, but it's something that's fake. It's a false alarm basically generated by other RF energy in the scene. And it happens like at the same intersections, and it happens to like about not 3 times every 100,000 miles, but like 3 times a week. And that's a huge amount of falsely activating the brakes. Back when I was at Waymo, that was one of the big deals, was like, yeah, we want to be safe and not hit things, but if we're hitting the brakes all the time, people are going to rear end us. And that's just not acceptable. That's not what we as a society allow other drivers to do and allow them to stay on the road. That's just not playing by societal's rules of how we will drive. So when we think about this, unintended consequences, are we going to see more false alarms and the ramifications of that? I think when you deep dive into the documentation with the regulation as well, it does talk a little bit. This is a step in the right direction, but it's, as in many cases, it's not far enough to really be incredibly useful. They talk about false alarm tests for the radar. And I believe that they are, driving between 2 other vehicles and something like there's a steel plate in the road, like a construction plate that you have to drive over and not activate the brakes, not false alarm on that and activate the brakes earlier than, there's a certain amount of tolerance in there for what you could do. But basically, you have to be able to drive through those situations. Okay, So you pass that test. What are the other situations? Are you going to be able to do that in the rain? Are you going to be able to do that in the presence of a billboard off to the side or a box truck off to the side? What are all the other things that go into the real world that you have to deal with now that you're going to have to be, not only worry about the system driving or the driving the car, but also is it going to, at a moment's notice, lurch you forward with a false brake? So as we start thinking through this, the unexpected consequences of this are something that we should think through. The other thing, when we think about the unexpected consequences, is there's a lot of language in there about keeping you from turning this off. You can't, as a dealer can't put in there, an OEM can't put in there the capability like, well, I'm just going to turn this thing off, like I'm going to turn off cruise control. It can't. There's some language about maybe you can have a workaround if you put it in like towing mode, but usually that's a different gear selection criteria as well that goes into that. So that's not something you want to do. So in terms of unintended consequences of that, let's think of that. Okay, now let's say the system has a failure, and it's not operating, it's causing false brakes all the time. You can't turn it off and get it to the dealer. So now you have to make something where you have to call in and get your vehicle towed to the dealer to fix this thing, because you can't just turn it off and drive it there yourself. So that we've elevated this particular requirement now to the level of like, this is a safety critical, mission critical, can't take the aircraft off type of failure mode. And that's a lot. I'm not sure that we've all thought through what that really means in that particular aspect of the language.
I'm going to summarize this as the little kid inside of me. This is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. There's no other way for me to say that to you. I have an electric vehicle, and it is a piece of junk, and it comes from a very well-known international brand, and I'm going through a process with them. And so I call up, and it's been in the shop 4 times in the past month. So I finally am at corporate now, and I got a nice lady on the phone yesterday, and she said, "Sir, you don't have to explain anything. I get these calls all day long." They have a dedicated EV number to call on the desk. "Sir, I understand. We went down to a golf tournament in Miami with my family. We're coming home to it, 70 miles an hour on 95. All of a sudden, the car slams the brakes down to 30. It scared the living you-know-what out of me. I've got young kids in the car. I've got my wife in the car. So I get on the horn. I call up. I said, "What the heck is this?" "Oh, we think it might have been a mapping issue." A mapping issue with a child and a wife in the car because your system can't cooperate? Well, then they said, "Bring it into the shop." They go through it, and we've identified this issue. It's well known. We're going to have to plug the car in, update software. You can't do an over-the-air update. No, you have to come into the dealer to do this. So if somebody rear-ended me with my family because of a malfunction in their system, which is very similar to this AEB mandate, who's to blame? Where does the liability lie? Does it come off of my insurance? Does the liability lie with the manufacturer? You talk about unintended consequences. There's going to be a whole bowl of pasta of unintended consequences that's going to come here. We have to think through it, and I'm going to say something very controversial. How many crashes will this cause? Because clearly the traditional OEMs do not have the technology figured out. Beat up on Tesla all you want. They understand over-the-air updates. They're gathering all that data. Beat up on Waymo if you're in San Francisco. Waymo has the data. They understand how to finely tune these things. You know from firsthand experience. We have to think through these. Do you feel that this AEB mandate was rushed through and not truly thought of the first level? And I'll give you a term from Howard Marks, the famous investor. The second level thinking. Did nobody think of second level thinking when they were putting this mandate into place?
I'm not sure. So I wasn't in the room when these discussions were going on. But just looking at this from a human nature standpoint, it may not matter. If your goal, humans are driven, especially humans in the workplace, are driven by goals that are set for them by someone else typically. And if your job is to hit those goals, then really the unintended consequences or these other things that you have to deal with, those are just those are collateral damage in what you have to do to achieve what's been told to you as your mission. So I don't know whether they thought about that or not. I think if you read in the 317 pages of this, there's a lot of, they did a decent job of commenting on all the reviewers. So they came up with like a draft version of this, sent it out for review and comments, and they got a bunch of comments back from everybody in the space. And then they tried to respond to the comments, but a lot of the times their responses were like, "We hear you, but we want to do this anyway." Or we believe that this is better than that. So, it's not really a level 1, level 2 thinking question. It's like, what is the ultimate mandate that they're trying to achieve? If your goal is if this is part of a larger system to produce more regulations on safety, then this meets its goal. For those of us that live with it and drive the cars that are based on that, I think we might ultimately or unfortunately be collateral damage in this case.
President Reagan had the great saying, "Hi, I'm here from the government to help," some of the scariest words in the English language. And it's clear from reading the comments there that, "Hi, we're here from the government to help." You don't want to listen. You just want to do what you want to do. And President Reagan so elegantly summed it up, which raises the question, where do we go from here?
That's a good question. So here's what's going to happen. People are going to have to put this in, right? This is a requirement. They're going to have to do more testing. There's going to be costs that are required to ensure compliance. And those costs come from something, right? You can pass some aspect of that on to the consumers, but the rest of that is going to come from other things that automaker may be wishing to do for their corporate needs, which might be increased autonomy, because they believe that truly increases safety and is a feature that if they can make it safe, people will really want to have. I've talked before on some different media events about everybody's kind of like waiting in this kind of detente of no one's really pushing for capability from an OEM. But as soon as somebody does, that opens the floodgates and now everybody's going to do it. Everybody right now is like waiting. It's like, well, no one else is doing it, so we don't have to do it. As soon as someone else does, that can upset the apple cart on that. So people are going to have to do it. The costs are going to come from somewhere. The costs are probably going to come from the OEMs pushing for the autonomy that we want to, because it can really truly be a life changer and lifesaver, not just 360 lives, but a much, much larger number than that. And you're going to see these issues coming up, and then they'll have to fix them because, only through getting lots and lots of data like you see in L4 companies, or when these roll out, and now you'll see more and more of these on the road, having to respond to you on the phone and my friend on the phone and so forth that are dealing with these, that they'll have to make it better. So they'll take some software updates to that, and that'll cause people to have to come back in and re-put in the software, and there'll be recalls and so forth that go along with this, which just basically spends a lot of money. And the money has to come from somewhere. I think it's probably going to be coming from the investments in autonomy at OEMs. At least that'd be one of the places, if I was a CEO of an OEM, I'd be like, well, we're not getting strong push from autonomy. Maybe we can license something from Waymo or whatever when that bubble breaks and someone else has it and we need to be responsive to that. But that's probably where the money's going to come from.
I'll ask you this as a follow-up to that. If EV sales continue to putter and companies continue to lose billions upon billions of dollars from EVs and the United States economy enters into a recession, does this mandate get delayed just purely based on the economic reality?
I don't think so. I don't think this is tied to EVs at all. I think this is independent of that. And really it should be. If I believed in this regulation, if I was a big fan of it, I wouldn't want it to be tied to, well, this is only going to wait until, we get a bunch of people with EVs. I want this to roll out as soon as possible. I'm not a huge fan of it for the reasons we discussed earlier, at least because we're not sure of some of the unexpected consequences and issues and opportunity costs that come with this. But either way, whether you like it or not, I don't think it should be tied to EVs. And I don't get any indication right now that it's going to be delayed, especially when you can say things like, well, 90% of the cars already have some aspect of AEB, and maybe they needed to tweak the software a little bit to make sure they hit the ped in those cases. Well, not hit the ped, hit the requirements for pedestrian AEB in those cases. I don't think there's going to be a lot of tolerance for delays with this particular regulation.
Well, there could be, there could not be. We never know. We can agree that we'll never know. Matt, this has been an extremely insightful conversation. As we look to wrap up for today, what would you like our listeners and viewers to take away with them?
Hey, thanks again for having me on the podcast here. It's always a pleasure, Grayson. This is a ton of fun, and I love how we can deep dive on these topics and really go deep on them and explore not just the technical or the business aspects, but actually we got into some really great aspects of human nature and aspects of how society deals with things today. So that's really a great opportunity, and I have a ton of fun here. If you're interested in more stuff about me or what I'm working on, you can always go to mattmarkel.com. That's got links to how you can follow me on LinkedIn, as well as links to my media page where you can hear this and other talks and shows that I've been on. All that's available at mattmarkel.com. And the easiest thing is go to that and then hit me up on LinkedIn and follow me. I'm trying to put out some more new content that talks about these sorts of things, as well as the lessons I've picked up as being a business leader for these last several years. Some of the key takeaways I've got from that I can help others basically go faster than I was able to, by standing on the shoulders, which is what we do in society anyway. We stand on the shoulders of those that came before us. I want to make sure I try to give back on that as much as possible. I'm looking forward to more people engaging in discussion through those forums.
Well, we're definitely looking forward to having you back on again. For our listeners and viewers that are interested, Matt wrote a fascinating book on radar. I believe you can get on your site. Is that available on your site, Matt?
There's links there. It's also available on Amazon. which is probably the easiest way. Even if you don't remember mattmarkel.com, you're going to remember Amazon. So and you can get it there. I do have another work in the pipes as well. I'm one of the co-authors of a book on, it's actually marketing for leaders. Areas I specifically chose to focus on was really getting clarity in your customer and your product and your business and how that can create effective marketing and more effective sales. So that'll be coming out. I'll put some announcements out on when that'll be coming out, but that'll be a little bit later this year.
And I'm sure it'll be on the Everything Store, aka Amazon. Go on Amazon, search for, I'll say Google. Well, it's a verb. Google Matt Markel. Find the book if you're interested in radar. It was extremely well done. Matt's background in DoD, everything he's done in defense and background in Waymo gives you a really great perspective on all things radar. And for the record, radar is cool. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is L4. Matt, thank you so much for coming on the road to autonomy today.
Thank you, Grayson. It's been an absolute pleasure.